Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues. With this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on Series 4, Episode 3 of Sherlock, The Final Problem. For all intents and purposes, the season finale, tentatively the series finale on whole. As of the time of this recording, I haven't heard any official word one way or the other if this is meant to be the series, on whole finale, that we will never see these characters again. But unfortunately, I'm leaning that way with the montage that came toward the end of this particular episode. And let me get it out of the way right away. This is going to be a spoilery discussion. If you haven't already seen The Final Problem, click off this video, come back after you've done so. Otherwise, you'll be sticking with me, so let's rock and roll. Now, when I first learned of the title for this particular episode, The Final Problem, I'm thinking to myself, well, they've dispatched Moriarty in the modern sense. And this was the sort of very divisive original canon story. The title is taken from, in any case, lifted from, where we saw an end to Holmes. For those who are even vaguely familiar with the original canon, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle saw fit to end the Holmes character because he had begun to feel that this was sort of, this character was clasping onto him, was beginning to rule over his life. There was an artist's depiction of Holmes being the ball and chain shackled around, Arthur Conan Doyle's ankles, signaling how very much that author felt about this character after a time. And there was a time before he actually had gone through with writing off the character in The Final Problem that he'd written to his mother. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote to his mother suggesting he was thinking about doing this, and she would not have it. She told him, do not by any means dare to do this. Do not make the mistake of doing this. And she even added inspiration to one of these short stories that Conan Doyle would eventually write. But he just couldn't get beyond it and ended up eventually writing The Final Problem, which saw, as I say, Holmes and Moriarty in their death clasp on Reichenbach Falls, and both men presumably fell to their demise. And it was interesting noting that this title, the idea of Moriarty coming back or reaching from beyond the grave, what did that mean? We've already seen sort of those aspects, those elements in this modern Sherlock series. So how can they do that without retreading or retelling the story? And I would not really have accepted, we've been faked out all along that Moriarty was actually still alive. Sherlock has hit that nail on the head several times in the modern series to say, no, he's dead, he's gone, there's no coming back. What is this? This is something posthumous. And it would have really disappointed me if we had actually seen, oh no, he was actually still alive somewhere out there. Somehow he had faked this. He had tried to double fake Holmes himself, who faked his own death and all that kind of stuff. And so, as is the case in the original canon, of course, for anyone even vaguely familiar, Conan Doyle would eventually bring the character back. I think he released The Hound of the Baskervilles first as a predated story, but then officially brought the character of Holmes back in the Empty Room, I think it was. And it's one of those interesting things where when he had first killed off the character, you think the Sherlock fandom in the modern sense can be incensed at the idea of losing any of these main cast of characters. Well, back in the day, I've read stories that the British citizens of the time when The Final Problem first was published, they were in an uproar. People actually took to the streets wearing black armbands of mourning over this fictional detective character, this fictional consulting detective character. This is how beloved he was. So I was really chomping at the bit to see just where in the hell they were going to go with this story, especially with the debut of a third Holmes sibling in the form of Euros, which was interesting to me because I thought Sharonford, they took inspiration, plucked out the name Sharonford, and Sharonford ends up not being her name. Sherry baby, as I said in my last video. Sharonford is a place, apparently. It's this, island prison where they lock down the worst of the worst of the worst dregs of humanity with, like abnormal brain sizes and things of that sort. And I mean, you almost have to, there has to be a suspension of disbelief for what Euros is able to accomplish in this episode, I think. If you can kind of get beyond, well, this just doesn't, how can any single human being, this doesn't make sense. How could she actually do all these things and manipulate all these people and get inside their minds and all that kind of stuff, no matter her abnormal intellect? How is this conceivable? If you can stop asking those questions, what you are in store for in this episode is an unrelenting, intense ride, a roller coaster that is highly, highly palpable. From the very opening scene, whereas we find Sherlock and Watson are messing with Mycroft, trying to pick apart his brain, having him run scared from a clown with a sword, and little people dressed as little girls, and like, what the hell is going on? You're thinking Yodos has come calling and wants to take Mycroft down, but that's the whole point. Sherlock needs to prove there is something to this whole Yodos thing. And you kind of, again, where that suspension of disbelief comes into play is, well, how is she in the prison, but she got out? But is there some other benefactors working? As soon as you see it's the same actress who's, played that character from her first appearance as the girl on the bus in episode 1 of Series 4, okay, well, it's got to be her. It's got to be legit. But how could she have done all that maneuvering around? And they explain it that she is able to sort of, in a profiler sense, get inside the psyches, the mentalities of whomever she talks to. She has a very sort of methodical, rapid-fire way of speaking, which, going along with other sort of, audio-visual, things that she does, like nodding her head, blinking her eyes, the way she speaks, the way she comes at you, I guess, whittles away at your sort of boundaries and gets inside and encapsulates your mind and then cradles it and takes it upon herself into her own hands so she can manipulate people in that way. And this must be how she got out, because she did this to, the cat who was effectively like the warden of this particular prison. And that blew my ever-loving mind. The idea of that, her being successful at doing that. But then, of course, you also have this predicament of the little girl on the plane, and this plane is coming crashing down, and I'm like, okay, what the hell? What in the hell is going on? At one point, Watson and Holmes and Mycroft, when they're being led on this merry chase that Yodos has designed for them, one of them brings up the idea of, well, we have to help her land this plane. And I'm like, are you nuts? Are you freaking crazy? How can you even conceive of doing that? This is a kid. If the kid doesn't know well enough, she knows well enough, apparently, to pick up a phone and communicate with you. But if she doesn't know well enough, hey, there's a steering wheel, grab it, direct it. Has she not seen any TV ever? Like, let her sit through an episode of Wings, the old TV sitcom. She'll figure it out, So I'm like, what is going on with this? And it's misdirections and rapid-fire twists and turns aplenty that it just, as I said, it grabs you by the lapels and does not let go. It is viciously shaking you. And my breath stayed caught in my throat throughout the entirety of this frickin' thing. It was mind-blowing. I was glad to have seen Mrs. Hudson again. I was glad we got more screen time with Molly. We saw Greg Lestrade toward the end, and everything like that. It still didn't answer to my complaint that I wish we could see more of these characters. But I mean, you don't have this series without the titular Sherlock and his Dr. Watson, his compadre, his buddy in arms. And they are, of course, always going to be the main focus. The whole idea of this sort of triumvirate that is created with Mary Morstan, who's then dispatched at the start of the series and then kind of has as a fill-in Mycroft in this predicament, that Yodos has set up. It's kind of strange, because that entire scene where they're weighing the balance of whose life matters more to Sherlock and to the equation, you have Mycroft, I think, somewhat uncharacteristically, though he has been growing into this ever since his first appearance in the very first episode of the series. He's evolved over time to actually be somewhat compassionate towards Sherlock and even Watson. And, he considers them brothers in arms to a point, as long as they exist as a means to his ends, But to see his trying to be rueful of Sherlock and demeaning and degrading, wishing that bullet for himself, to not dispatch Watson and break up that partnership that is Sherlock and Watson, was actually chilling. Mark Gatiss just absolutely wowed me in his performance, from the sheer terror he was going through at the start, but then to almost make a selfless act. Here is a character so uncharacteristic to such an act, and he did it so believably and movingly. And the idea of this is all to whittle away at Sherlock's psyche. You've had Mycroft doing this ever since they've been growing up. with this suppressed memory, the overhanging red beard and what all that amounted to, you've had Mycroft watching Holmes since the very beginning. And I thought it was very cool, again, referencing back to the 7% Solution, the Nicholas Meyer penned, episode 1, if you will, of his novel trilogy. That reformed the entire sort of canon, not an official canon entry, but it reformed the history of Sherlock Holmes. If you've seen any of my previous videos talking about the modern series or anything like that, I've referenced this story before, how it reimagined what happened in between those stories that saw to the end of Sherlock Holmes, The Final Problem, and I believe it was The Empty Room was his comeback story. There was a whole thing about him basically going on a journey of self, exploration in the wake of finally getting to the end of his cocaine addiction. And, it was finding out that Moriarty was not, in fact, this, grandstanding kingpin of crime. There was more to it and all this kind of stuff. Completely reformed the life that you knew, the familiarity you had with Sherlock Holmes. And I feel like this thoroughly does that. Not only with the debut of Yoros the sister, but the whole Redbeard thing, the Mycroft thing. He's completely reformed his youth in his mind, suppressed and rewritten those memories of the tragedy that was borne out by Yoros in their childhoods. She was a lonely individual. Science dictates people with sort of a very high intelligence often feel alone and do not want to be surrounded by people. And here was a girl who, in her childhood, she was a kid. She wanted those things. She wanted to be cared for and taken after and being able to have fun and have friends and all this kind of stuff that Sherlock had. And so she struck at him. Her jealousy struck at him. And as we find, Redbeard is not, in fact, a childhood dog, which would have really irked me anyway. But even potentially more devastating, it was Sherlock's childhood friend. Because of his passion to want to be a pirate in his youth, he and his friend, he was Yellowbeard, his friend was Redbeard, and so it was just absolutely malevolent and tragic. And the actress, whose name I haven't, actually learned as of yet, who played Yoros, was just absolutely malevolent and scary. I mean, this is the first time I watched anything in a long time, horror movies included, and I'm not even that big of a horror guy, where I was, again, the tension was palpable. I was actually scared about what the hell was going on. And she, all of those on-screen shots, kind of like something out of The Ring, the movie The Ring, her being on screen, it properly freaked me out. And I'm like, take back everything I said. Well, not take it back, but everything I said about Toby Jones being even that much greater of a threat, potentially, than Moriarty before him and Magnuson before that, or vice versa, Magnuson and then Moriarty, if we're going backward. Toby Jones as well, he was dripping wet with malevolence and this murderous tenacity. But you can't top Yoros, not only for how personal a connection there is between she, Mycroft, and Sherlock, being their sibling, but the performance was tour de force. I use this term over and over and over again with this series, tour de force, from blowing up the boys' flat, 221B Baker Street, which just blew my mind. It's like, what are you thinking? How could you do this? To getting into Sharonford, this prison, with the misdirection, you're thinking, oh, it's Holmes in all the makeup, and no, it's Mycroft. Again, Mark Gatiss just nailing this performance. Martin Freeman's John Watson, one of the things I've loved about his performance is his stoicism and his rigidness. He really comes across as a lifelong soldier, or at least someone who's been on the battlefield long enough to have felt, impacted in a lifetime's worth of events. His rigidness, his stoicism is outstanding to me. There's a point where they say, as a call to arms against what Yoros, this, grand path she's leading them on, where he says, we're soldiers. And there's one point where he feels bad for the wife of the sort of warden guy being killed after the warden kills himself, where Sherlock has to remind him, we're soldiers. And you see, Martin Freeman, straighten up and just lock down and be ready for the oncoming storm of this eastern wind, this battle set before them. And it's oh man, it's just every dripping minute of this thing. The whole idea of breaking down the relationship between Sherlock and Molly. She is desperately in love with him. It will always be unrequited. You know, there will be no reconciliation between them, I would think, after this especially. Because he pushes her at Yoros's behest to admit how she feels, but only if he'll reveal that first, you know, even if it is a sort of faux sense of revealing that to Molly. It's tragic. It's despicable. You know, and there's still that sort of mouse in the back of my head thinking to myself, well, how could really Yodos have done all this? The three guys leading, you know, one of the sort of deductions she puts Holmes through, you know, which one of them killed their brother or whatever it was. You know, you got the guy with glasses, you got the guy who's a drunk, you got the guy with the LASIK surgery, he's taking care of himself, he's probably the one. And then she kills the other two. But then she kills the third guy too. It's like, WTF! What is this bitch doing? Why is she doing this? And to have it all full circle, I mean, I was heavily reminded with this, getting the reference of the Musgrave Ritual, one of the original canon stories, Musgrave Place or whatever it was called, the homestead of the Holmes family. I was so heavily reminded of Skyfall, the Bond film, one of the recent Bond films, that saw him going back to his homestead from childhood and everything. Only this was, I think, much more bittersweet in tying it all back together with that girl on the plane. And it was all Yodos seeking help, seeking companionship, trying to call out her voice in the dark for someone to take her up in their arms and hold her and embrace her and just tell her it's okay. For all of that intellect, for all of that loneliness, for all of that murderous intent, you know, after so many years of speaking to almost no one. And being able to find a footing to get out into the world and mess with those who did it to you, you know, it was absolutely compelling and captivating. And, you know, I gotta say, as we get to the end, do we have another posthumous message from Mary, a PS, postscript, that just wraps everything up in a tantamount bow of perfection, as far as I'm concerned. Explaining what this show is, what these characters are, their brotherhood, their commitment to seeing, you know, justice put to crime and criminals, and the passion they have for each other, you know, and how they are family. Sherlock says, you know, when they bring Mycroft in to explain what is Yodos, what is Sharonford, and all this stuff at the beginning, John stays because he's family. They're family. They're brothers. And again, it all comes full circle with that, with her promise that everything is right in the world as long as you two stick together and continue what you're doing, continue your efforts, unfettered. And that is what we essentially see with, you know, that sort of final montage. You get references to the Dancing Men, which is one of my favorite original canon stories, as well as other, you know, things. The guy who drops dead. There was a story where a guy walks in and literally drops dead in the original canon, such like that. I don't remember all the titles. It's been forever and a day since I've actually sat through reading them, and I've read them all, like, you know, at least 3 times, and then gone back and read a couple more of them a few more times. My favorites, like the Speckled Band and such like that. And to have Sherlock and Watson running out of Rathbone Place, I think it was, Basil Rathbone was one of, you know, the on-screen actors to portray Holmes, and I believe one of the favorites of Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss. So it's just like, damn. You know, damn. Oh man, this just, it was an amazing, palpable, tension-filled watch with something for everybody, and mind-blowing, and just, I mean, if this is to be the finale of the series, they went out with a hell of a bang. And I do hope, as a Sherlockian, of you know, fan of the classic canon and some of the stories abroad by other writers and everything, as well as a very much big Sherlockian fanboy of this modern series, I've been Sherlocked, baby. You know, I do hope we'll eventually see more, even if it's like a movie of the week kind of thing, or, you know, just one outing instead of 3 every season, whatever it is. I would love to see more, but I know Benny Benedict Cumberbatch, who, again, tour de force in his performance. He's got Doctor Strange, he's got the Marvel films and everything like that, other projects as well. I'm hoping to hear more on Martin Freeman and, you know, some of the other actors and actresses in this series, see what they're doing. But I would love to revisit this world again if, unfortunately, this does not ever, you know, potentially happen. I can be satisfied with this final season, if it turns out to be the final season, with what we've been given. I'm still smarting over the end of Mary, you know, the way she went out, sacrificing her life for Sherlock. Still a bit bitter about that. I still don't quite buy it, but, you know, if you're going to swallow Yodos being capable of all these things, well, then you got to sort of take it with a grain of salt, I guess. And, but everything else was absolutely amazing. It was a spectacle of modern television, movie-going to behold. And that's this entire series in a nutshell. Since the very first second of the very first episode, I have loved every damn minute of it. And so yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of the final problem, if you've seen it as well, if you were as astounded by it as I was, what you thought of the twists and turns. And yeah, otherwise that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.